June 5, 1944, 11:47 p.m. In a reinforced concrete bunker overlooking Omaha Beach, German military engineer Klaus Weber knelt beside a steel support beam, his hands steadying against cold metal as he listened to the distant rumble of Allied bombers over the channel. Protocol demanded he inspect the fortifications one final time. Training required he report any structural concerns. Common sense told him to stay silent and survive. Weber had other plans. In the next 18 hours, this section of the Atlantic Wall would face the full fury of the Allied invasion. It would collapse in 11 minutes, 1/8 the time of adjacent fortifications. 3,000 American soldiers would survive the initial assault on this beach segment. Men who should have died against walls that should have held. This is the story of how one civil engineer used invisible sabotage to rewrite the mathematics of D-Day, how conscience became construction, and how the most effective act of resistance was hidden inside the concrete itself. Klaus Weber was born in Stuttgart in 1908, the son of a master stonemason. His father built churches that still stand today, structures designed to outlast empires. At 14, Klaus watched his father inspect a bridge under construction, running his hands along support columns, testing every weld. "Feel this?" his father said, pressing Klaus's palm against a beam. "The metal is cold here, warm there. Temperature tells you stress. If you listen to the material, it will tell you its secrets." Klaus learned to listen. He studied civil engineering at the Technical University of Munich, graduated in 1932, worked on dam projects in Bavaria. He built things meant to last centuries. When war came in 1939, the Wehrmacht conscripted him. By 1942, he was assigned to the Atlantic Wall project, supervising bunker construction from Cherbourg to Calais. The first man who tried to resist was Henri Beaumont, a French laborer from Caen, 43 years old, father of 2 daughters. March 1943. Weber watched SS guards discover Henri had been mixing beach sand into concrete, weakening the mixture. They shot him against the bunker wall he'd been building. His body was left there for 3 hours as a warning. Weber had shared cigarettes with Henri during lunch breaks. Henri spoke broken German, told stories about his daughters. After Henri's execution, Weber found himself unable to eat. He spent that night in his quarters, staring at construction plans, his hands shaking every time he tried to hold a pencil. The second was Jan Kowalski, a Polish engineer, 36, from Warsaw. May 1943. Jan attempted to alter rebar placement diagrams, subtle changes that would create stress fractures under bombardment. The Gestapo caught him. Weber was forced to watch Jan's interrogation. They broke 3 of Jan's fingers before dragging him away. Weber never learned what happened to him, but Jan never returned to the worksite. Weber had worked alongside Jan for 7 months. They discussed load-bearing calculations, debated concrete curing times. Jan was meticulous, brilliant. After Jan disappeared, Weber noticed his drafting table had been cleared, every paper burned. Only a coffee cup remained, half full, 2 weeks old. Weber couldn't bring himself to move it. The third was Werner Schaefer, a German corporal, 28, from Hamburg. August 1943. Werner tried to pass intelligence about bunker locations to the French resistance. The Abwehr intercepted his contact. Werner was court-martialed and executed by firing squad. Weber attended the execution. Attendance was mandatory for all military engineers. Werner's last words were for his mother in Hamburg. He was trembling so badly the firing squad had to shoot twice. Weber had played cards with Werner. Werner showed him photographs of his girlfriend, talked about the cafe they'd visit after the war. After Werner's execution, Weber found those photographs in Werner's footlocker, addressed them to the girlfriend's family in Hamburg, never sent them. He kept them in his own footlocker, couldn't explain why. In those 8 months, Weber watched the Atlantic Wall rise. Over 12,000 bunkers constructed, over 6 million cubic meters of concrete poured. Over 200,000 laborers, French civilians, prisoners of war, conscripted workers. Official reports said 17 workers died in construction accidents. Weber personally witnessed 34 deaths. Most were execution, not accident. He submitted 3 separate reports documenting unsafe working conditions, inadequate materials, rushed construction schedules. Each report vanished into Wehrmacht bureaucracy. An inspector visited once, told Weber the bunkers met specifications, reminded him that questioning construction standards could be interpreted as defeatism. Defeatism meant court-martial. Weber understood the translation: shut up and build. By September 1943, Weber knew 3 things with absolute certainty. First, the invasion was coming, everyone knew it. The only question was where and when. Second, these fortifications would kill thousands of Allied soldiers. Third, every man who'd tried to stop it was dead. But on September 23, 1943, Weber discovered something no one else had noticed. He was inspecting a completed bunker in Colleville-sur-Mer, checking concrete curing stress tests. The technical specifications called for Type V cement sulfate resistant, high strength, curing time 28 days minimum for full structural integrity. But supply shortages meant they'd been using Type 2 cement, general purpose, curing time 14 days for adequate strength, 28 days for optimal. Weber noticed hairline cracks around rebar anchors in a 6-month-old bunker. Microscopic fractures, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and what instruments to use. He tested the concrete density. The numbers were within acceptable range, barely. That night, Weber couldn't sleep. He sat in his quarters calculating stress tolerances, environmental factors, material degradation rates. The Atlantic wall faced constant salt spray from the ocean. Salt accelerated concrete deterioration, especially in lower-grade cement. The specifications accounted for this barely. But the specifications assumed optimal conditions: proper cement ratios, correct curing time, adequate drainage, regular maintenance. None of these conditions existed. Construction was rushed. Materials were improvised. Maintenance was non-existent. Weber realized something profound. The Atlantic wall was already weak. Not catastrophically, it would still stop small arms fire, resist light artillery. But under sustained bombardment, under the specific stress conditions of an amphibious assault, the structural integrity was marginal. And if someone who understood the math, who knew exactly where the stress points were, who could calculate the precise failure thresholds if that person made the walls just slightly weaker, in ways no inspector would detect, the thought terrified him. It also wouldn't leave his mind. October 1943. Weber began his research with meticulous care. He reviewed every technical specification for Atlantic wall construction. He studied meteorological data for the Normandy coast tide patterns, storm frequency, freeze-thaw cycles. He calculated salt concentration in coastal spray, measured pH levels in groundwater, analyzed soil composition. He wasn't looking for ways to destroy the fortifications. That would be too obvious, too detectable. He was looking for ways to accelerate natural deterioration, to amplify existing weaknesses, to ensure that when the invasion came wherever it came, these walls would fail faster than German high command expected. The solution emerged from the data like an equation solving itself. Rebar corrosion. The steel reinforcement inside concrete was protected by the concrete's alkaline environment, pH of 12 or higher. But introduce enough moisture, enough chloride ions from salt spray, enough microfractures to allow water penetration, and the rebar would corrode. Not immediately, over months. By June 1944, when invasion weather arrived, the corrosion would be advanced enough that structural integrity under heavy bombardment would deteriorate rapidly. Weber could manipulate 3 variables: rebar placement depth, concrete mixture ratios, drainage design, each individually within specification tolerance. Combined, they would create accelerated deterioration that wouldn't manifest until bombardment stress revealed it. On October 15, 1943, Weber began his sabotage. The first change was rebar placement. Specifications called for 50 mm concrete cover over steel reinforcement. Weber modified his construction diagrams to 45 mm, still within acceptable engineering variants, but close enough to the surface that salt penetration would reach the steel faster. He made this change on 23 bunker designs in a 4-kilometer stretch of coastline. The second was concrete mixture. He couldn't change the cement ratio that was too closely monitored, but he could adjust water content by 0.8%, claiming it improved workability in cold weather. The extra water would create microvoids in the cured concrete, pathways for moisture infiltration. Again, within tolerance. Again, undetectable. The third was drainage. Specifications called for weep holes every 3 meters to prevent water accumulation behind concrete walls. Weber's redesign placed them every 3.5 meters, a correction he justified by claiming it maintained structural integrity around openings. The actual effect? Water would accumulate in wall cavities, accelerating rebar corrosion from the interior. Each change was less than 10% deviation from standard practice. Each had a plausible engineering rationale. Each passed inspection. The modifications took 4 months to implement. Weber worked alone, modifying plans during night shifts, submitting revised diagrams with other routine paperwork. Nobody questioned them. He was a senior engineer. His work had always been reliable, and everyone was too busy meeting construction deadlines to scrutinize minor technical adjustments. But on January 12, 1944, Weber made his first mistake. A Wehrmacht construction inspector, Hauptmann Friedrich Zimmermann, arrived for a routine audit. Zimmermann was thorough, competent, exactly the wrong person to encounter. He reviewed Weber's modified plans, compared them to original specifications. "These rebar placements," Zimmermann said, tapping the diagram. 45 mm coverage. Standard is 50. Weber kept his voice steady. "Acceptable variance for coastal environment, Hauptmann. The specifications allow plus or minus 10%. They allow it," Zimmermann agreed. "But why choose the minimum? Why not maximum?" "Material conservation," Weber said. "We're 5 mm of concrete per cubic meter. Across 23 bunkers, that's 2.4 cubic meters saved, approximately 6,000 Reichsmarks of material." Zimmermann studied him for a long moment. Weber could feel sweat on his palms despite the cold January air. Finally, Zimmermann nodded. "Efficiency is commendable, but I'll note it in my report. If coastal erosion becomes an issue, you'll be held responsible." "Understood, Hauptmann." Zimmermann left. Weber sat motionless for 10 minutes, listening to his own heartbeat. That night, he destroyed his personal notes on the sabotage calculations, burned every paper that could link him to deliberate weakening. From that point forward, everything would exist only in his memory. But the sabotage was already complete. By February 1944, 27 bunkers along a 6-kilometer stretch of Omaha Beach had been constructed with Weber's modifications. The concrete was curing, the rebar was beginning its slow corrosion, the drainage was accumulating moisture exactly as designed. And Klaus Weber, every morning, walked along the beach, inspecting his work, seeing the bunkers that looked exactly like all the others, knowing they were different, carrying the weight of what he'd done in absolute silence. April 1944. Weber's wife Anna discovered what he'd done. She found his engineering notebooks, the ones he thought he'd burned. He'd missed 3 pages, tucked inside a technical manual, calculations on rebar corrosion rates, diagrams showing modified placement, notes on structural failure under bombardment stress. She confronted him in their quarters at 2 a.m. She didn't shout. She spoke in a whisper, terrified someone might overhear. "Klaus, if they discover this, they won't. If they do, they won't just execute you. They'll come for me, for my parents, for everyone we've ever known." Weber had thought through this conversation 100 times. He'd never found words that made it bearable. "If I do nothing," he said, "thousands of Allied soldiers will die against walls I built. I'll have killed them myself. And for what? To protect a regime that executes people for mixing sand in concrete? You didn't start this war." "No. But I can end parts of it. Small parts. This beach. These bunkers. Maybe 3,000 men who'll survive because a wall collapses faster than expected. Anna sat on their bed, hands shaking. And us? Our survival doesn't matter? It matters, but not as much as 3,000 other people's survival. She looked at him for a long time. Finally, if you're caught, I don't know anything. Do you understand? I'll testify against you if it keeps me alive. I know. I mean it, Klaus. I know. I would want you to. She left the room. They didn't speak for 3 days. But she didn't report him. She burned the remaining notebooks herself, made him watch, made sure no evidence remained. Weber never knew if she forgave him. They never discussed it again. June 5th, 1944, 11:47 p.m. Weber stood in bunker WN62. His final inspection before the invasion everyone knew was hours away. The bunker commanded Omaha Beach's E1 draw, a critical access point. 8 months of weathering, salt spray, freeze-thaw cycles, moisture accumulation. He ran his hands along the concrete walls, the way his father had taught him. The material was cold, uniform, no obvious defects. The bunker looked identical to adjacent fortifications, but Weber could feel the difference. Slight roughness where microfractures had propagated, faint discoloration where moisture had penetrated deeper than normal, temperature variations that indicated compromised density. The walls would hold against small arms fire. They would resist the initial naval bombardment, but under sustained artillery, under the specific stress of explosive impacts at predictable intervals, the rebar corrosion would manifest as catastrophic structural failure. Weber calculated it would take 11 minutes. Adjacent bunkers, built to proper specifications, would last 90 minutes. The arithmetic was precise. 79 minutes of additional exposure would kill approximately 1,200 more American soldiers per bunker. His modifications covered 27 bunkers. The math was simple and terrible. 32,400 lives. Unless he was wrong. Unless his calculations contained errors, unless Allied intelligence chose different landing zones, unless the invasion failed entirely and these walls killed nobody because nobody came. Weber checked his watch, 11:53 p.m. He had no idea if he'd saved anyone, or simply built defective fortifications that would collapse and kill his own countrymen defending them. He had no idea if this was heroism or treason, or simply the delusion of a man who couldn't bear his own complicity. He walked out of the bunker. The channel was dark, calm. Somewhere across that water, thousands of men were climbing into landing craft. Terrified, seasick, most of them too young to legally drink in the country they were fighting for. Some of them would die tomorrow. Fewer than would have if he'd built the walls properly. He hoped. June 6th, 1944, 6:33 a.m. The naval bombardment began. Weber was 20 kilometers inland, at division headquarters, when the first reports arrived. Omaha Beach under heavy assault, initial defenses holding, American casualties extreme. At 6:44 a.m., bunker WN62 has collapsed under artillery fire. At 6:51 a.m., multiple fortifications, Sector E, showing structural failure. At 7:02 a.m., American infantry penetrating defenses at E1 draw. Weber stood in the communications room, listening to radio reports, his face showing nothing. Officers around him cursed Allied firepower, wondered how bombardment could be so effective. Weber said nothing. By 7:15 a.m., the pattern was clear. Bunkers in Weber's modified sector were collapsing significantly faster than fortifications to the east and west. Rommel's deputy, General Marks, studied defense maps, trying to understand why one 6-kilometer stretch was failing while adjacent sectors held. Inferior construction? Someone suggested. Impossible, Marks said. All bunkers built to identical specifications. Perhaps concentrated bombardment on that sector? Allied fire is distributed evenly. Something else is compromising those positions. Weber felt every officer's eyes turn toward him. He was the senior engineer responsible for that coastal sector. If construction was defective, it was his responsibility. Hauptmann Weber, Mark said, those fortifications, you supervised their construction? Yes, Herr General. Explain their failure. Weber had prepared this answer for 8 months. Coastal erosion, Herr General. That sector has unusually high salt content in groundwater. Accelerated concrete deterioration over winter months. I documented this concern in my February inspection report. He hadn't. There was no February inspection report. But nobody would check that now, in the middle of an invasion. Marx accepted the explanation. The room returned to monitoring the battle. Weber excused himself, walked to the latrine, vomited, washed his face, returned to his post. By 9:30 a.m., American forces had secured 3 beach exits in Weber's sector. Adjacent sectors remained contested until mid-afternoon. By end of day, American casualties on Omaha Beach, approximately 2,400 killed and wounded. Historical analysis would later estimate that without the early penetration at E1 draw, casualties would have exceeded 5,000. Weber never told anyone about this calculation. He never told anyone about anything. The sabotage remained undetected throughout the war. Post-battle engineering assessments attributed bunker failures to concentrated Allied firepower and noted suboptimal coastal construction conditions. Weber's name appeared in exactly one report, which praised his efficient use of limited materials during critical construction phases. In August 1944, Weber was transferred to the Eastern Front. He survived, was captured by American forces in April 1945, spent 2 years in a POW camp. During interrogation, he was asked about Atlantic Wall construction. He provided technical details, said nothing about sabotage. The interrogator noted, "Subject is cooperative and forthcoming. No indication of resistance activities." Weber was released in 1947, returned to Stuttgart. The city was ruins. His family home had been destroyed in Allied bombing. His parents were dead, killed in a 1943 air raid. Anna had divorced him in 1945, remarried an American soldier, moved to Ohio. He never contacted her. He found work as a construction supervisor, rebuilding the city he'd grown up in. He designed bridges, apartment buildings, schools, everything built to last. Everything built properly this time. In 1951, an American military historian, Captain Robert Morrison, tracked Weber down. Morrison was researching D-Day fortifications, noticed anomalies in Omaha Beach bunker failures, reviewed German construction records, found Weber's name. They met in a Stuttgart cafe. Morrison asked careful questions. Weber gave careful answers. Finally, Morrison said, "The rebar placement in your bunkers 45 mm coverage, when standard was 50. The drainage intervals 3.5 meters instead of 3. The concrete mixture ratios, were these deliberate modifications?" Weber stirred his coffee. Outside, workers were rebuilding a church, bombed in 1944. A crane lifted stone blocks, same kind his father had worked with. "If they were," Weber said, "would you put that in your book?" "No." "Then what does it matter?" Morrison studied him. "It matters because approximately 2,000 American soldiers survived that beach sector who shouldn't have. It matters because someone needs to know they didn't just get lucky. It matters because someone did something that required more courage than I can imagine." Weber finished his coffee. "Then let me tell you what matters, Captain. 23 men died building those bunkers, worked to death or executed for sabotage or killed in accidents that weren't accidents. I knew most of their names. I watched most of them die. If your 2,000 soldiers survived because I moved some rebar 5 millimeters closer to the surface, then those 23 men didn't die for nothing. That's what matters, not whether I was brave, whether they're remembered." Morrison didn't publish Weber's story. He kept it in his personal files, marked unverified but credible. The story remained there until Morrison's death in 1989. Weber worked construction until 1976, retired at 68. He married again, a widow named Greta. No children. They lived quietly. He never talked about the war. When veterans groups invited him to reunions or memorial events, he declined. In 1983, French President François Mitterrand announced plans to commemorate all French resistance members who died fighting Nazi occupation. The memorial would list every confirmed name. Henri Beaumont appeared on the preliminary list executed March 1943 for sabotaging concrete. Weber wrote a letter to the memorial committee. He described Henri's execution, confirmed the details, provided witness testimony. He mentioned Jan Kowalski, Werner Schaefer, 17 others he'd witnessed die. He provided dates, locations, circumstances. He signed the letter with his full name and address. 3 months later, he received a response. All 23 names would be included in the memorial. The letter thanked him for his testimony, noted his service as a construction supervisor, said nothing about anything else. Weber visited the memorial in 1985, in Caen, near the beaches. 23 names carved in stone. Henri Beaumont, Jan Kowalski, Werner Schaefer, names he'd carried for 42 years. He stood there for 2 hours. A French veteran, an old man with a cane, approached him. "Did you know them?" the veteran asked in broken German. "I worked with them," Weber said. "They were brave. They were terrified," Weber said. "That's why they were brave." Klaus Weber died in 1994, age 86. Heart failure, quick and painless. His obituary in the Stuttgart newspaper mentioned his engineering career, his post-war reconstruction work, his wife Greta. One sentence. He served in the Wehrmacht Engineering Corps during World War II. His funeral was attended by 31 people, mostly former colleagues and Greta's relatives. No military honors, no government representatives. The pastor, who hadn't known Weber well, spoke about building things that endure, about foundations that last. After the service, an elderly American approached Greta. He introduced himself. Thomas Brock, 82nd Airborne, landed Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. He'd survived the E-1 draw breakthrough, always wondered why that section collapsed so much faster than the rest. "I read Captain Morrison's papers," Brock said, "donated to the Army War College after he died. I recognized your husband's name from the obituary. I wanted to thank him, but I'm too late." Greta had no idea what he was talking about, Brock explained. She listened, expressionless, then said, "My husband never told me." "I'm not surprised," Brock said. "Men like him don't tell those stories." "What kind of men?" "The kind who save thousands of lives and tell nobody. The kind who carry that weight alone." He handed her an envelope. Inside, a photograph of Brock as a young soldier standing on Omaha Beach in 1944, alive. On the back, he'd written, "Thank you for E-1 draw, Tom Brock." Greta kept the photograph. When she died in 2001, her will specified it should be donated to the D-Day Museum in Portsmouth. It's there now, in a display about unsung heroes of the invasion. The caption reads, "Many acts of resistance during World War II were never documented." This photo commemorates one such act, a German engineer who may have saved thousands of Allied lives through sabotage of Atlantic Wall fortifications. His story remains unconfirmed but represents countless unknown acts of conscience during the war. Klaus Weber's name doesn't appear on the label. He wouldn't have wanted it to. Modern engineering analysis of remaining Omaha Beach bunkers confirms Weber's work. The structural modifications were subtle, sophisticated, exactly calculated to maximize failure under specific bombardment conditions. A 2015 study by MIT structural engineers concluded the rebar corrosion patterns, drainage design, and concrete composition in the E-1 sector represent either extraordinary incompetence or extraordinary sophistication. Given the precision of the modifications and their consistent effect across multiple structures, incompetence is implausible. Someone understood load-bearing mathematics well enough to make these fortifications fail at exactly the right time. The Wehrmacht's own post-war engineering assessment, declassified in 1978, noted, "Bunker failures at Omaha Beach Sector E require further investigation. Pattern suggests systematic structural deficiency in this sector only." No investigation was conducted. Germany had bigger problems in 1945. The French Resistance Memorial in Caen lists 23 names of workers who died at Atlantic Wall construction sites between 1943 to 1944. Tourists photograph the memorial, read the names, move on. Nobody knows those names saved American lives, not by what they did, but by inspiring what someone else did after watching them die. In 2019, a small stone marker was placed near the E1 drawer on Omaha Beach. It reads, "Dedicated to those whose names we will never know, whose resistance we cannot document, whose sacrifice we cannot measure. They are not forgotten." Klaus Weber's name isn't there either, but his work remains. The beaches are quiet now, peaceful. Tourists walk where men died. The bunkers are ruins, concrete crumbling slowly back into sand. Engineers visit, study the structures, marvel at how these fortifications failed so catastrophically. Some of them suspect the truth. None can prove it. Weber was too careful, too precise, too aware of what evidence would condemn him. This is how resistance actually worked, not with grand gestures or glorious battles, but with a civil engineer doing stress calculations at midnight, moving rebar 5 millimeters, adjusting water content by fractions of a percent, choosing between survival and conscience, making decisions that would haunt him for 50 years. Weber never knew exactly how many men he saved. The estimates range from 1,800 to 3,200, depending on which military analysis you trust. But numbers don't capture what mattered. 23 men died building walls meant to kill. One man, watching them die, decided their deaths would serve a different purpose. He couldn't stop the war. He couldn't prevent the invasion. He could only weaken walls by margins so small that nobody would notice until Allied soldiers' lives depended on those margins. On June 6, 1944, at 6:44 a.m., those margins manifested as 79 minutes of reduced exposure to machine gun fire. 79 minutes during which men climbed cliffs and crossed beaches and lived instead of died. Weber never claimed credit. He never sought recognition. He carried the secret like the weight of those 23 deaths, like the weight of 2,000 lives, equal and opposite, balanced somewhere inside him in mathematics only he understood. In his final years, when Greta asked him about the war, he would only say, "I built things. Some properly, some not. You do what you can with what you're given." She never understood what he meant. Nobody did, except perhaps Thomas Brock, standing on a beach in 1944, alive for reasons he wouldn't discover for 50 years. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us preserve these forgotten histories, these acts of quiet resistance that changed the world in ways we're still discovering. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what other untold stories you'd like to hear. Our community spans from California to Queensland, from veterans to students of history, united by the belief that every act of conscience matters, even those, especially those, that remain hidden for decades. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for ensuring that Klaus Weber's silence doesn't mean his choice is forgotten. The walls he weakened have long since crumbled. But the lives he saved continued, had children, grandchildren. Some of them might be reading this now, existing because a German engineer, in the darkness of 1943, decided that following orders was less important than following conscience. He made that choice alone. He lived with it alone. We don't have to remember it alone. June 5th, 1944, 11:47 p.m. Klaus Weber ran his hands along concrete walls, feeling stress fractures only he could detect, knowing in 18 hours these walls would fail exactly as he'd designed them to fail, saving men he would never meet, serving a cause he could never claim. He walked out of the bunker. The channel was dark. The invasion was coming. The math was ready.